SEO Pub, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can prime ChatGPT to give you content that is about as Google friendly as you can get out of it. What we're going to do is we're going to train it on how to follow some of Google's guidelines to produce content that is SEO friendly. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to actually train it on some of Google's announced guidelines that they like to follow and have it keep those things in mind as it's generating content for us. We're first going to give it this prompt, and what we're going to tell it is if you wanted to create a new piece of content built to perform well in Google search based on the text, what key instructions would you give to them? The text that we're going to use, we're going to go to this announcement from Google about their helpful content update back in August, and we're just going to copy the whole thing. And we're going to feed that in as the text. Okay, so it read through the text and it kind of summarized it into these 5 points that it feels is the important context of that text. What we're going to tell it next is, I want you to remember those 5 points. Let's call them the helpful content guidelines. Okay. And it says it's going to remember them as the helpful content guidelines. Now we're going to grab the same prompt. We're going to do the same thing, but this time what we're going to give it is we're going to go to the Search Quality Raters Guide. And what I'm interested in is the EEAT guidelines, which is on page 26. So we're going to scroll down to page 26, and it's actually 26 and 27. And we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to copy and paste this. Okay, so it summarized that. Also, it happened to be 5 points, which is fine. And we're going to do the same thing. I want you to remember these 5 points. Let's call them the EEAT guidelines. It says sure, it's going to remember those. Now, if you want to test it, you can ask it to show you that it's remembering these things. Okay. So it's got these guidelines remembered now. And from here, you have it primed. You could, if you wanted to, go and look for other documents that you wanted to follow, other Google guidelines. You also, if you have internally, you have your own kind of like SOPs that you follow when generating content to make them SEO friendly. Anything, other instructions that you'd want to feed it, or any other documents that you want to feed it, you would do it at this point and name those something like helpful content guidelines, EEAT guidelines, whatever you want to name it. So at this point, I'm going to skip that though. And you could also, I've shown in other videos, different how to train it on other pieces of content. But for this video, we're going to move on and we're going to start thinking about what type of content we want to create. I'm going to create a piece of content about what's called the Zettelkasten method. You don't need to know what Zettelkasten is. It's not important, but it's a note-taking and information storage system to follow if you're into that. If you're into the PKM or personal knowledge management communities or build a second brain communities, you've probably heard of it. If you ever read the book How to Take Smart Notes, it's based on Zettelkasten. We're just going to use that for this example. And the prompt that I'm going to give to ChatGPT is I want it to start pulling entities to show me. So you tell it, if I wanted to create a new article that was a guide on how to use the Zettelkasten method that will target as its primary keyword Zettelkasten method, what are the most semantically related entities that I should include in the content? I want you to put them in a table showing the entities, their salient scores, and how many times you recommend to use each one in the piece of content. Now, a couple things about this. Number one, there's a ton of tools out there that will pull entities for you, give you entity ideas. They'll do comparative analysis of top ranking pages. You can do whatever you want to decide on the frequency you want to use the entities. I like to fill them in here just to give ChatGPT some kind of a guideline to follow. You could skip that if you wanted to. You could feed it entities that you wanted to use. So you could add in additional entities here from any of those other tools that you might use. Also, just to note that I've found that ChatGPT is not real good at remembering data in a table. It just, for whatever reason, it won't do it. So I had to create this table just so you could visually see what we're doing. It looks a little nicer, but I'm going to ask it to grab that same data but put it in a text version instead of a table version. Okay. So now's where we're going to kind of put it all together. And I'm going to give it this prompt here. Tell it, keeping in mind the helpful content guidelines, EEAT guidelines, and entity data, I want you to build an outline for an article about the Zettelkasten method titled The Ultimate Guide to Zettelkasten. Okay, and then I add in here, do not include information about the helpful content guidelines, EEAT guidelines, or entity data in the outline itself. They're guidelines for you to use in creating the outline. I put this in here because every now and then, for some reason, it tries to throw in like helpful content guidelines at the end of the outline, or how EEAT relates to Zettelkasten. Like, I don't know why it'll do that, whatever your topic you're writing on. So I specifically give it instructions not to include them in the outline. So the next thing that I do then, it came up with a great outline here. Now I'm asking it to go through and just change the outline using H2, H3, and H4 headers. And the reason that I asked it to convert these into those headers is I normally would feed this into an article brief and I'd want it styled that way. Okay, so it's pretty good outline, a lot of detail here. I mean, this covers everything you pretty much want to cover about Zettelkasten system. We're ready to start creating content. And what I've found with ChatGPT is I would not try to ask it to write all this content. It'll give you the best content if you ask it to go section by section. So instead of trying to write the whole article, we're going to give it a prompt just to get it started on the introduction. And this is what the prompt will look like. So we're going back to the last video I did. If you haven't watched that, go check it out, about reverse prompt engineering. I'm asking ChatGPT to give me the ideal prompt to generate the content that I want. So I'm saying, I want you to create a prompt for me. This prompt will command you to write the introduction of, I missed the word there, of the article we have discussed. It should be based on the outline you just provided and should instruct you to follow the helpful content guidelines and the EEAT guidelines. It should also instruct you to use the entity data. I want this prompt to be as detailed and long as necessary. The article should also be written from the point of view of someone who uses the Zettelkasten method regularly. That last sentence is there for the EEAT guidelines, that one E that stands for experience. If you give it this instruction, it'll write more of the content from the point of view of someone who has used this, is familiar with it, rather than more of like a book definition of things. It'll talk more about its own personal experience in using this. Okay, so there it came up with a prompt. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You can pause the video and read it yourself. But what we would do then is use that prompt to have it write an introduction. There we go. Now it goes a little too specific in this here, saying, as with all content, it's important to create people-first content that's accurate, honest, and safe and reliable. In this article, we'll cite expert sources, providing trustworthy evidence to back up claims. I'd probably rewrite that part, but the rest of it's pretty good. If you don't like it, you could certainly just regenerate, just use the prompt again, have it generate another introduction. And then if you're seeing what I do, if I'm seeing a specific pattern where it's consistently doing something that I don't necessarily want it to do, I just go back up and edit the prompt to give it instructions not to do that. But at this point, what I would do then is go back to the outline. So we had the introduction. Next, I'd ask it, give it the same prompt, but instead of the introduction, I would tell it I want it to write about part 2 of the outline, getting started with Zettelkasten. And everything else can stay the same. It'll go through, start writing that. Make sure to tell it to include a section about the setting up your Zettelkasten system and how to get started with your first note. Do that, and then you go on to the next section and so on. And the whole time it's going to be you're telling it to keep in mind the helpful content guidelines, the EEAT guidelines, and the entity data that you fed to it. And by doing that, you'll get some pretty good SEO optimized content out of it. You still want to go through and do your own edits and make any changes that you need to, but you can pretty quickly generate some solid content this way. Now from this point, what you can do is you have kind of a trained SEO writer, more or less. If you want to generate content on another topic, you can go through these steps again and repeat the whole process. Or once this content's generated, if you don't care about the rest of this discussion anymore, you can go back to where you were done training the training ChatGPT. So here we had it remember the helpful content guidelines. Then we gave it the EEAT guidelines, told it to remember those. And the next thing we did then was get into the entity information about a specific topic. So what you could do, if you just want to keep this as sort of a bot that you can go back to and start generating content again, at this point, you can edit the prompt and you can change it to whatever the new topic is that you want to write about. Hit save and submit, and what ChatGPT does is it forgets everything that happened after this discussion. Everything's cut off at this point, and it's starting from right here. So now you have basically a SEO writer that you've trained to follow EEAT guidelines, trained to follow the helpful content guidelines, and from here it's going to continue on about whatever new topic that you gave it. So you can keep going back and reusing this over and over. Or again, if you just want to start over each time you do it, you can feed it in whatever, along with the helpful content and EEAT guidelines, whatever other information that you want to feed it to train it on. So that's it for this video. Make sure that you head over to the SEOpub.com, sign up for the email list where I send out tips like this every single week, and I'll catch everyone in the next one.